Good books, real good books, 11 out of 10, 11 out of 10. That's what I would rank them. We're probably going to be talking about them a lot, but today I just wanted to hone in on one idea that is echoed in these writings because it's very much aligned with what I have been grappling with lately. Been talking a lot on this channel about ego death, and its role in spiritual awakening. And I've been wrestling with this because in a lot of the old school teachings, we are told that the end goal of a spiritual awakening is ego death. And it's an idea that I just can't seem to get behind. I can't seem to wrap my little pea-sized brain around it. So please tell me why I'm wrong in the comments. But today I wanted to share with you an alternative to ego death and something that is echoed in these books in an interesting way. So like I said, a lot of the old school teachings tell us to die before we die, right? To have this experience of ego death. And I'm not saying the experience of ego death is problematic. I don't think so at all. I think the act of chasing ego death is problematic, and today we'll get into why. First off, and I've said this before, trying to kill the ego, like consciously trying to kill the ego, is like putting out a fire with a bellows pump, right? All we're doing is blowing it up. So these people who make ego death their goal will, do a bunch of drugs. They'll meditate in self-isolation on mountaintops for years. And they end up like sad hamsters on a wheel to nothing. And not the nothing they had hoped for, okay? Not sunyata, but just like going nowhere. And to understand why people get caught in a loop like this, and why this is probably not somewhere we want to be, it helps to understand the fundamental principle behind all healing. So healing 101. You and I came into the world whole. Everyone came into the world whole, and then life happened. It kicked shit out of us and we fractured. Happens to us all. Healing then is the journey back to the wholeness that we came from. And the catalyst for healing is often a spiritual awakening. Anyone can decide to go to therapy, pick up self-help books, work on themselves, and improve their life, right? They'll usually only do that just enough to mitigate the negative consequences. A spiritual awakening is a little different. A spiritual awakening is like God lighting a fire under your ass and telling you to come home to yourself, motherfucker. By the time most of us are adults, we're kind of a mess, right? Some people have experienced serious trauma. All of us have experienced inheriting the wounds of our ancestors, right? The limiting beliefs of our family and our close circle has been transferred to us. We have absorbed all of the ways in which society tells us we're not good enough. We have hidden away the pieces of ourselves that were deemed socially unacceptable or unlovable. And we have given up any pieces that set us too far apart from our peers. And so by the time we are adults, we're kind of a mess. I have a mentor friend that says we're not broken, we're just dented because we can pop the dents out. But however we phrase it, it's this idea that as we progress through life, we move further and further away from that state of wholeness that we came from. And healing, specifically the variety of healing catalyzed by a spiritual awakening, is a journey back to that wholeness. And so that is why everyone is on a healing journey, whether or not they are conscious of it and whether or not they are active participants in it. And so the question becomes, how do we make progress in this journey? And it boils down to that fundamental principle behind all healing, which is this. With any challenge that we experience, any challenge that comes into our life, any piece of ourselves, we only have one of two options. We can accept or we can reject. That's it. Now, when we reject something, an emotion that we're having, an experience that we're going through, an element or a trait in ourselves, we further contribute to the fracturing. But when we allow it to wash over and through us, when we accept it as it is, when we sit with it, then we are moving in the direction of healing. So when we reject something, we're fracturing. When we accept something, we are coming into wholeness. This is what Jung called integration, and it is 180 degrees in the opposite direction of trying to kill parts of ourselves. And this is why I don't subscribe to the pursuit of ego death. If you are trying to kill your ego, if you are saying, I want my ego to die, then you are in essence rejecting a piece of yourself, and not just a piece of yourself, okay, but your sense of self while you are here on this earthly plane, right? The ego is your sense of self while you are here in this incarnation. And so rejecting that Trying to kill that is the ultimate rejection of who you came here to be. I repeat, consciously trying to kill the ego is the ultimate rejection of who you came here to be. I'm not saying we should identify with the ego, okay? I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is honestly what I've expressed in other videos, which is that I think an alternate perspective is that instead of killing the ego, just be aware of the ego and what it is and the function that it serves, simultaneously walking this line of knowing your true nature, right? Source, spirit, the great mystery, God, universe, whatever you want to call it, okay, the absolute. Recognize your true nature. And despite that, despite knowing that, choose to play human, okay? Choose to play the role that you incarnated here to play. But a lot of people who get on this quest want to kill the ego and transcend themselves so they can play God. I don't think we came here to play God. I think that's missing the point. So having read a bit about all of this and honestly encountered a lot of people who have made ego death their goal, I personally have chosen a different direction. Like I don't see the ego as inherently bad. I see it as something that is a necessary mechanism in our psyche to help us function in the 3D. And so I stand by the idea that perhaps the goal is not to kill the ego, but to transmute it. And I was really delighted to find this reflected in the writings of the Ruiz family. So Papa Ruiz wrote the 4 Agreements, which you may have heard of. It's a pretty famous book in this genre. And Papa Ruiz has 2, I forgot his name, I think it's Miguel Ruiz, but he has 2 sons, Don Miguel Ruiz Jr., and Don Jose Ruiz. And what's cool about this family's work is that it is steeped in the Toltec tradition. And the Toltecs are a Native American tribe, an ancient group that had really interesting ideas about the human experience. And they had this belief that we are essentially living in a dream. So you and I each have an individual dream, right? Called our personal dream. Everyone on the planet has a personal dream, and all those dreams come together to create the dream of the planet, which is the world we live in. And I love the language they use to describe these things. So our personal dream is very much informed by the thoughts we have, by the voice in our head. And they call the voice in our head, or the voices in our head, narrators. And when you have a lot of those voices all going at once, that kind of chaos that's created by lots of different noise happening in your brain, in your headspace, they call it mitote. Sounds a lot like the ego, doesn't it? But it's not just one voice, which is why I kind of like this model. It's multiple voices. And I remember reading Eckhart Tolle like 2 years ago, who's one of the big authors on like ego and ego death. And I remember thinking to myself, like, what do you mean just one voice? Like, it's such a clusterfuck up there. It's not like there's an agreement, you know what I mean? It's like a million parties all having their own say. I don't know half the time. And of course, all the narratives in our head come from the same area, really. Like it all comes from the linguistic center. So it's all technically one thing. We could call it the ego, but I just, for the purposes of modeling, I really like the idea of having multiple conflicting voices up there. And they call these voices an ally if they are positive and a parasite if they are negative. And this is very much aligned with what I believe, that the ego isn't inherently bad. It is something that needs to be transmuted into something more positive. And even so, it's not our true self. But I really like the way that Don Miguel Ruiz Jr. writes it in The Mastery of Self, when he says, "It's important to understand that neither the parasite nor the ally speaks as the authentic self. The authentic self is the divine, the energy or spirit that gives life to your mind and body. When you identify with the voice in your head, you confuse the narrator for who you really are and become its slave in the process. When the narrator speaks as your ally, you feel happy, and when the voice of the parasite takes over, you become sad or depressed. But as a master of self, you know that neither voice is ultimately you, as neither represents the whole of your authentic self." Now, this is quite different than all of the teachings that tell us the end goal of a spiritual awakening is to kill our egos. And I'm not even saying that's necessarily wrong, right? I don't think it's a matter of right and wrong. I think that our approach to the spiritual quest and the mindset we bring to spiritual questions has a lot of influence over where it is that we end up. And this is actually a point of debate in the study of mysticism. So in mysticism, we have what we call perennialists and we have constructivists. And perennialism is this idea that all roads kind of lead to the same place. And so perennialism is a lot like idea sex in the sense that you're looking at different cultures, thinkers, and disciplines. You see where they overlap, and where there's overlap, there is truth. So those things, the similarities between different teachings are what point to the ultimate truth. Constructivists look at the differences between different cultures, thinkers, and disciplines, and they argue that the differences will lead people to very different states of consciousness. I think both of these things are true. And it's interesting on the note of constructivism, you know who wrote about this quite a bit without using those terms necessarily, but it was Gopi Krishna. We've talked about him in other videos. And he actually has an entire chapter dedicated to bashing on Alan Watts in the Kundalini Awakening, which you can imagine how I felt about that because Alan is one of my favorites. But it, again, goes back to that idea that there's no one right way to do this. I think that there's a lot of paths, and it all kind of takes us to the same but different places, if that makes any sense. So to summarize, just an idea hat to try on. What if trying to kill the ego is a trap? And it's a trap because, one, the thing that wants to kill the ego is the ego, and so it's motivated by this kind of self-hating or self-destructive tendency. And two, if enlightenment is the state of ultimate wholeness, how can we possibly get there by rejecting pieces of ourselves? I don't know. I actually have no idea. I don't have the answers. I'm just asking the questions. I'd love to know what you think in the comments. I'd love to have idea sex with you in the comments. Thank you for tumbling down the rabbit hole with me today. Hail to the power and the sight. And until next time, I hope you stay very, very blessed, my friends.